Hi, so my name is Debi Gresham. I'm the assessment coordinator for Umpqua Community College. And we have a panel up here today that we have a few question prompts, and then we're just going to share some of the things that are happening in our colleges and how they relate to these question prompts. And time permitting at the end, we'll have opportunity for you guys to share as well. And we have some microphones so we can walk around and hear what's going on across the state. So we'll start out with introductions, if that's okay. So like I said, I'm Debi Gresham. I'm the assessment coordinator for Umpqua Community College, and that is a full-time faculty position. So I'm faculty, and I work with our faculty right now, and then we're in the process of rolling out to student services as well.
And I'm Sergey Shepelov, Chief Data and Assessment Officer from Mount Hood Community College.
I don't even know who I am anymore because I just got married, so I'm Amber Ashpole Ridgway. Anyway, I don't even know how that feels. I'm the new faculty assessment lead for Southwestern Community College, Southwestern Oregon Community College. I don't even know where I belong. And I also teach humanities, world mythologies, and religion and writing. So this is a brand new gig for me, and I'm still teaching and doing this at the same time. So we're rolling it out. Let's use this one.
Yeah, rules. I'm Kirk Gibson. I'm the Vice President of Instruction at Rogue Community College. I'm in my 10th year there.
And he takes instruction well. And I'm Elizabeth Cox-Brand, the Executive Director of the Oregon Student Success Center.
All right, so as we get started, I'm actually going to pose just a question and find out, do you want to start right with the questions, or do you want to take another minute and talk about, for those who's relevant, talk about the assessment at your schools and what's happening?
You've heard from Rogues, because Lori is who I'm working with on that. So I think you've gotten a good piece of the context for how we're working at Rogue, and I'll try to follow up on some of that or include that in any of my answers or not, depending on how you felt about what we already said.
Southwestern Oregon Community College, we have taken, ironically enough, the same approach as Lynn Benton, only we were kind of siloed, right? So we thought we came up with this brand new thing. Isn't that how it always is? And our assessment approach is being faculty driven, but it's also focusing on the faculty with the idea that when our faculty reflects and changes and affects improvement, the items that are associated with faculty will also improve, such as student success, approval with accreditation, and we'll make a stronger teaching team, which will then result again into student success and so on and so forth. So we're focusing on the faculty, and that's the strongest, most stable thing we have, and we believe that that will lead to stronger student success. So it's a little different, but I apparently have cooties.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, we at Mount Hood also kind of initial stages. I mean, obviously assessment has been happening throughout the years, but, you know, we've had the accreditation visit last year, and as many schools, we also got recommendations that we need to improve our assessment system at all levels, including course level, program level, general education level. So what we're doing now is that we have created educational assessment action team, and it has a couple of deans, but lots of instructors representing about 7 or 8, I can't remember exactly, representing different areas, and we hope that within few months that we come up with a plan that we will start to implement. And our goal is that, you know, traditionally we always like, you know, spend years and get something perfect, and you know, year after year we go in and then people leave and then nothing happens again. So we want to try a different approach. So we designed something that, you know, that maybe not perfect, but something that we can try and see how it works. And then as time goes, we will just make incremental improvements to what's already in place, rather than just spend years trying to get to that, you know, ideal place that eventually never happens.
And at UCC, we're kind of, we were really remarkably similar to Christy this morning, and then what everyone has said here too. We really wanted to, whenever I got my position, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time waiting and waiting and waiting for everything to be perfect, so we just kind of jumped in. We started at the course level. We started with with our outcomes, and then just began building along that and working, getting faculty involved at the very beginning and just kind of building up. So we started at course and we're building up as well. All right, so I'll just start with actually I'll just go down the list and so we'll see how it goes. So the first two questions have to do with some of the initiatives that are out there right now. So the first one is, how does the Guided Pathways Initiative impact our thinking about general ed mapping, outcomes, and assessment? Any order you want.
Go, Sergey.
Well, for us, that's another thing that we sort of started on guided pathways about a year ago, but then we had lots of organizational changes, restructuring, and that kind of was forgotten, and we haven't done that for probably a few terms, if not the whole year, probably last year. So now we're kind of trying to revive this again, so we're at a very initial stage of doing that. So I don't see that, we haven't really considered much how it's going to impact. But I mean, obviously, my hope is that, if we have a little bit, more specific choices for students, it's probably going to simplify our work with gen ed mapping and its assessment that, versus when students have a choices of hundreds of classes that could fulfill the same requirement, it definitely makes much harder to assess the overall picture.
We just came back from the Guided Pathways meeting and realized that we had Guided Pathways kind of all along. So I'm not sure if we're going to formally adopt that or not, but the idea of limiting choices makes sense to some degree, and yet not in other degrees for when I am a faculty member and I don't want to lose any of the humanity courses that we've already cut down. And I know that's the age-old argument between administration and faculty and student success, but for me personally, and I know I don't speak for the college, so I'm sorry, I don't think any credits are lost credits if you learn something, so that's one of the things that I think about. And as far as it aligning to everything, we're actually quite lucky that we have all of our course outcomes aligned to our program outcomes, and we also have all of our, we call them global student learning outcomes. They're all available, and we are now taking it down to the assignment level. So we look at an assignment and then decide whether it's impacting the course outcome or the program outcome or the global outcome. And we're looking at it assignment by assignment. And it's kind of tedious, but we're doing it slowly, and I think that it will have impact in the long run. For Guided Pathways, I just don't know what our plan is.
And I don't think we're dissimilar. I think we started from a place of having about 987,312 pathways for students, because the philosophy is there. We want to be clear about where students are heading. We want to make it accessible to students so that they can get there. But I think we had a very diverse and wide-ranging look at where we actually wanted students to go. And I always think in terms of metaphor. I get punished and fined at the college every time I go down that road. But I'm not at the college, so you can neither punish nor fine me. I really think in terms of divide and conquer by identifying a clear destination. And I firmly believe that the college should not be in the business of worrying about how we choose to get somewhere. We need to be extremely clear about where we want to go. So if I say we want to get to New York, I need my teams, I need my faculty, I need the college to work in a way that supports getting to New York. I don't need to care if it's by plane or by car or by train or by foot. I want to be able to assure that my students that they'll get there on time, and they'll get there in a predictable way so that they can be comfortable on their flight. And that metaphor works for me a lot, because there are times I want to take a train and I've got the time to do it, and I can allow myself the pleasure of the scenery and the stops and the visibility. There are other times I need to get to New York. I have got a pressing issue. I need to change my financial situation. I need to change my economic standing. I need to change my place in the world. I don't have time. I don't want to enjoy the scenery. I have a goal. I like the Pathways movement as a binder for that way of thinking. And I think as a philosophy, it works very well. We were leaning into that, was our lucky piece at Rogue already, and felt that mapping, you can already begin to see where my head goes. It is the mapping part that I think helped us be ready for the pathways work. We're already talking about how do we define that journey. We're already talking about what are the important milestones on the way. How do we know they're not wasting a bunch of money? How do we recognize that some students need to wind their way there and others need to bust a hump and get there in a hurry? So the mapping piece was a logical component before we bit off the big guided pathways component. I think in terms of guided pathways component, the big key word for me is weeding. I think right now faculty hear pathways as nothing more than a narrowing of choice and a tossing out of options. If you saw the slides that we gave through earlier, though, the weeding happens from a very different perspective. It's on making sure that that journey is meaningful, not on identifying parts that are wasted. And that's a subtle but big difference to me. I've liked the mapping as a key piece, so that's kind of how it's fitting in with our pathways work.
Well, about the only thing that I can add to it is one of the key components of guided pathways is ensuring students are learning. That's a key element, and the only way that we're going to be able to do that, obviously, is if we're assessing correctly. So following up on just what Kirk had said too, though, guided pathways are the what that we're doing, it's not how. It's not the how. It's the framework that's helping us to think about what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think from the conversations I've been a part of, I think at Umpqua we're kind of at the same place. We had people who attended the recent event as well, and we're starting to have the conversations and think about what this could look like for us. And we have some people who are really excited about it and think this is a great model, and now it's just a matter of figuring out how that model works for us and how we fit into it, or fit it into what we're already doing.
One last thought on that too, Debbie, just because I think this is another myth about guided pathways. Similar to what we've been talking about with assessment, there's not one right way to do it. Mm-hmm. There's not one guided pathways model, and that's how you do it. It's different for every college. Everybody does it in a little bit different style because we're all different colleges, all different students, all different faculty. So there's not just one model. It's not the cookie cutter.
That's a great point, and makes it a lot easier to think about adopting when you know that it's what works for your college. All right, so the next one then, if we're all done for now, is how does the new Senate bill, House Bill 2998, relating to transfer of credits to public post-secondary institutions of education, impact our thinking on general education outcomes and alignments and assessment? Now don't fight over
Yeah,
that.
right?
Right?
All right, I'll start since I think that was kind of thrown in. Thanks, Lori, wherever she went. Yeah. So House Bill 2998 is the bill that we're calling, it's the transfer bill. So if you're not aware of that, it was passed in the last session, and it basically is now requiring there to be pathways through the community colleges to all 7 of the public universities. And we're supposed to be developing universal statewide transfer agreements. So hopefully gone are the days of the thousands of articulation agreements that every college has to keep together for each one of the universities and each program to each one of the universities. That's the idea, is to weed out that kind of mayhem, because that doesn't serve our students. So right now, the work group, which I'm a member of the work group, has met twice, and we just had our second meeting, and we just now have divided up into 2 subgroups. One subgroup is the policy subgroup, which is those of us that deal with more of the bigger picture end of the world type things, like what is a universal statewide transfer agreement? What does that mean? Terms such as lost academic credit, what does that really mean? And then the other group is the curricular group, and that one is basically all faculty that have been on the work group. There's one faculty member on the policy group, but the rest of the faculty are on the curricular group. And the curricular group is tasked with creating a foundational curriculum that's supposed to be 30 credits of foundational curriculum that can transfer to any one of the universities and be applicable to any one of the majors. So one of the first decisions that group has is how many foundational curricula do we have? Because I think we're all pretty clear that just one's not going to do it. You can't be getting set up to be, a biochemist and to be a literature major necessarily with the same 30 credits. That biochemist has got to be taking some certain lower level biology courses, chemistry courses, and whatnot that maybe the person going into the literature may not need. So that's part of their decision making. Cross your fingers, because by February 1st, the foundational curricula is supposed to be laid out. Yeah, it's almost November. So there we are. Yep, breathe, Julia. We got it. So how this all works out with general education mapping and everything, one of the pieces that has been resurrected in this work has been general education outcomes. And they were sort of mentioned this morning as far as the AAOT was concerned. But this was work that was done through JBAC, 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? When? 2000, it just seems like 30 years ago. A few years ago, just yesterday, yeah. But there were faculty from all across the state and across all the institutions that got together and agreed on outcomes for general education courses. Because when we talk about this, one of the reasons I asked Lori to tell you that the bill that was in your packet is not the official bill is because it has the language in there about common course numbering. And I don't want you all to wig out over that. That was just a placeholder. That's no part of this, so please don't get hung up on that. That was just the initial placeholder for the bill so we could work out the actual language of it. We recognize that the course numbering is not the issue. We could call the same courses the same numbers, and the universities could still say, we're not going to take it. It's the outcomes that are important. And so we had a presentation with a couple of members from JBAC, the Joint Boards Articulation Commission, who were part of that work initially, that came in and were talking to us about why they came to this point, why they were doing this work, what it meant. And it's really pretty much the foundation of the work that the 2998 work group is supposed to be doing. Because if we look at outcomes and we can say, we can agree, these are the outcomes that we all think a student should have as part of general education in their writing course. It's similar to what Kirk was talking about, getting to New York. I don't care how you get there, just get there. You can call it writing 121, or you can call it writing 115, or you can call it writing whatever. If it meets these outcomes, and we've all agreed on that, that's the important part. So those general education outcomes are extremely critical as we're looking at this particular bill and looking at this work moving forward.
Anybody else want
Yeah, at Mount Hood we realized a couple of years how serious of an issue it is, the issue of articulation of classes to universities, because we even created, I think it's last year, a new position of Articulation Coordinator. We tried even to figure out what courses are actually being accepted at the universities, because quite often they're just being accepted as, elective courses, not actually the courses they are. And what happens is that the students taking these courses without even realizing that when they go to the university, it's not going to be accepted as that. So when we've done that research, we found sometimes the whole disciplines, like every single course in the whole discipline would not be accepted at any of the university except as just an elective, which usually students tend to have way more electives than they actually need. And that's, leads to the financial aid and other problems, and obviously the graduation on time. And so I personally think that, if this is done right, it actually would be a huge help to students, because we're kind of trying to do that. But, even with the creating a position of the articulation coordinator, I don't think, of course, we've got lots more data, we are more informed, but I don't think we have done much progress in actually fixing this issue. And having state look at that probably will have way more impact than as a single school we could do.
And I'm just going to run with my airplane thing for a second. So to me, philosophically, I really am behind the transfer bill. It's like telling somebody, I need you to get to New York. And it's like telling them at the same time, even though you believe there's a direct flight, and we talk about it like there's a direct flight, there's no direct flight. And I need you to take yourself back in time prior to the internet and Kayak and Expedia and all those. Not only is there no direct flight, there's no one place you can look to see where all the airlines connect. Not only that, New York is already built for you to arrive in New York because the presumption is you're already there. So all the tour books talk about what to do when you're in New York. They don't tell you how to get there. Now, not only that, you're going to go to Toronto and you're going to find you're going to have to fly backwards to Seattle because for some unknown freaking reason, it's cheaper to fly from Seattle to New York than it is from Toronto to New York. So please fly from Toronto back to Seattle to save yourself money and fly to New York. It is ridiculous what we actually think about expecting our students to do if you think about it that way. Because the reality is it's not New York. It's 5,387 other definitions and destinations. Because some of them are going to Harvard, and some of them are going to Stanford, and some of them really just want the next welding certificate so they can advance in their career. We are not good as a system at helping our travelers identify how to get there, much less where the heck they're going. So philosophically, I'm all on board. Cool. Now I got to figure out my flights. I'm also agree very strongly with Elizabeth. I think outcomes will be the old term, the lingua franca. There's a way to sound like an English guy saying something in a foreign language. We need a way to articulate across a diverse group of practitioners what we actually mean by what we say. And I think in outcomes is the ability to do that in an effective and meaningful way that works for all of the constituencies, including a student. I can talk to a student about what you're going to need to do out there and what I'm doing in here to get you to that point. I can talk to an industry partner. What do I need them to do out there? What do you need them to do? All right, here's what I can do to get them there. I can have that same conversation internally, and I can have that same conversation at U of O. I think the outcome language is the only way we're going to crack this nut, or we will devolve into a rollicking and wonderful and exciting debate where we're all looking for the nearest grapefruit spoon to dig out a chunk of our thigh to stop talking about why it should be 121 or 122. So I'm a big fan of it. I think there's going to be tremendous challenge in how we get to that point. And not to be the cockeyed optimist in the group, I actually think Pathways is a way to do that, because it gives you the common framework and the common language to reach the common destination. So we actually all start talking about flying to New York instead of you're going by bus and train and car and you're walking and you're in an Amish cart. So I think out of those two pieces, it gives us a way to talk to groups that don't necessarily have our same interests or our same language in a way that helps us bridge that gap.
I can't follow that. Yeah, just drop the mic. Yeah, I'll do that for you. I'm just a faculty member, so I don't know very much about it. I know we have somebody on is it a commission or what is it that they're? It's a work group. A work group that's going to hold our own for us. And quite frankly, as a faculty member, I don't know what it will involve or what it will devolve into. I also know that as a student, it is frustrating when your stuff doesn't transfer. But if you go out of state, it's not going to transfer. So it's only going to work if it's in-state, am I correct? So it's only in-state transfers, yeah? Well, for the bill. For the bill. So until I think something is more national, and I don't know if that will ever come about, that could be my idealistic thing. It seems to me if we could get Oregon all together, that'd be great, but a lot of students transfer out of state, so then they're back in the same boat. So, or ship or plane, and we don't know where they're going. Ox cart. I vote for the transporter myself, so now I'll drop the mic.
All right.
Kirk, that could work.
Yeah, beam me up.
Well, I agree that he covered it quite well, and there's not much to say about that. Other than I wish that Christy had not have left, because after his speech, I feel like we all need the outcomes chair now. This would be an appropriate time to add that in. So let's just move on to the next one. So what are some approaches and challenges to mapping and assessing general education outcomes within the AAOT the AS transfer, the AAS degrees, and certificates?
I think challenge number one is that we have a bit of a round peg in a square hole problem, because Pathways works intuitively and practically a lot easier on the CTE and direct program side, because your endpoint is clear. Here is the demonstrable skills we need. Here are the outcomes that we're looking for based on a more easily outlined, defined, and seen trajectory. I think in terms of transfer, because the connective tissue is very complex on the side where students come out, it's very difficult to define it as a program. Yeah, and that's what we keep trying to do. So what I see us doing is what our typical academic structure is. Well, if we can't do it for all of humanities, let's bust it down a little bit and see if we can do it with pieces. Now we're going to write a writing program. Then all of a sudden you realize, well, that's not necessarily true either, because we have a technical track and we have a professional track and then we have an academic track. Well, let's try doing that. And all of a sudden what you're actually writing are just big, loud course outcomes. They stop being program outcomes or or general ed outcomes. So I think we have to, as a group, begin to figure out, sorry about that, I got that a little far away. Figure out when we say gen ed outcomes that we're not trying to make them into programs. I think we need to talk in two ways. One, I heard Rob Johnstone talk about this. This is not my thinking. There are definitely clear times, and it's hard to say as an ex-humanities guy, where we are not an endpoint. We are in service to another degree or program. And I am all right with that. I know I'm not creating, as a writing instructor or a speech teacher, a lot of professional speakers. I'm giving them a skill that will sit in service to something else that they as a student want to do, be it interview well, be it present a topic or an idea for a patent, whatever, you get the idea there. Be on a panel. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there aren't going to be many of me wanting to do this again. And I think that somehow identifying the difference between when that gen ed outcome is functioning in service of a different package, then you write the map to that other package. Then you've got a trajectory, right? I think the flip side of that is, instead of breaking it down smaller, we were talking at our table earlier, I'd like to give credit to my team for this idea. As you begin to think about it, the Pathways work helps us, because if you think about a pathway of arts and letters, there is an outcome. They need to transfer successfully to X. Then you can begin to break backwards from your outcome, right? If my outcome is transfer, there are key points I know they're going to need to have. If you're in your writing and humanities sequences, research skills roll right back up again. You can look at what they need to do out there at U of O or PSU or SOU, whichever your big partners are. You can backwards design your outcomes across the humanities section. So ironically, I think we need to go against our own nature to specialize and go broader. All of a sudden it starts to feel then you're not jamming a program definition around a non-program, which I don't know about you all, but every time we try that, we get down to a level of detail where we realize we've written ourselves right out of program goals again. So stop, go the other direction. And I think we need to explore that more, but I think that's an idea. They're going to thank me for this over there at the rogue table. I think that's an idea we're going to start to run with, because that seems to make more intuitive sense. That gives it that Pathways feel back to me.
Anyone else want to comment on that? No? Okay.
No, panel is plural.
Well, and another issue is general education, that we also probably need to realize what's the purpose of general education. Why do we do that? Why students need that? Because when you go to students, quite often students hate that. They think like, why do we need that? Mm-hmm. What's the purpose of that? And can we actually articulate properly what value it brings to them? So I think that also should be things we need to consider before we assess it. Why do we do that? So we could create the assessment properly.
That's an interesting point too. Why do we do it? So that I'm going to transition into number 4, because it says, has your institution begun the work of assessing general education outcomes in a systematic way? And So we, at my school, at Umpqua last year, we approached it from, we did take the AOT and we said, okay, so if our transfer degrees, the sort of an overarching goal is that they're transfer, we're going to use this AAOT model, then let's start aligning those transfer courses. And so we broke away from departmental or program goals. We tried to do away with the writing specific and the science specific and go to the AAOT, which we did find that, like was mentioned this morning, some of them are pretty difficult to assess. And so I really appreciated the message this morning about let's look at the intention of them. And I think that will make it easier as we go forward. We did not incorporate those AOTs yet into our AS degrees or even our AAS degrees. For those, we kept the specific program and looking at that. But if we are going to have a conversation about general education and how it impacts everything, being able to look at the AOT outcomes from the intention behind it and seeing how that fits into all of the different areas will make that easier to do and make it easier to incorporate. And so we've been using them. We've been trying to use them this past year as part of our assessment process that we're building, and we've been asking those transfer courses to identify which of the AOT outcomes they relate to, and not necessarily just broken down by the headings, but which one applies to your course, and have them include that as part of their assessment process, how they're aligning, how they're assessing that, and how they can use that to help improve, be a part of that continuous improvement cycle.
For the gen ed outcomes for us, now that I have my voice back, we actually have a spreadsheet in which you have a course, and then you list your assignments, and you look at what assignments will address what course outcome, and then you go a little bit over, and you look at what assignments, those same assignments address which program outcomes, and then the general global learning outcomes, our institution outcomes, are then the next column. So our instructors can take a look at an assignment within their course and see where it maps out all the way across. And they can put 5, 6, 10, 12 assignments on there if they want, and then they can look and see, wow, there's nothing here in the global outcomes. I never addressed this. Is that good or bad? And some of them will not have, many times, like computation, mathematics won't be in the humanities. I feel bad that I don't have anything in there, but it's just not going to happen. You know, I want them to learn math correctly. They're not going to learn it from me. So, but they can look at each course then and see that, wow, I have all these courses in my program, and at a glance, the spreadsheet's out there. And then we're working on getting those digitalized. So that, I don't know if I just made up that word. Did you like that? Digitalized. English is an evolving language. But the idea is that once we get them in the system, we should be able to pull up a course and an assignment and see which global outcomes it meets, and then plot it that way. So we're doing it a little differently, but I'm happy with it so far. We shall see.
Can I ask a clarifying question of you?
Me?
So
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
So when you think of general education outcomes, you're thinking the institutional level outcomes?
We're looking at the institutional outcomes that we have borrowed from the value rubrics from the ACCU.
Okay.
Yeah, because we made those a long time ago. And then those feed into our mission.
And I think that's maybe part of like the whole conversation is common language, because when we think of general ed, we more like a program. So we have our CTE program or our AAS program outcomes, and then general education outcomes are for the transfer, and then we have the institutional that goes over all of that.
We just have the ones that finish, right? Am I right? I'm looking at my dean. Help. Oh yeah, we do, yeah. But in this case, we're looking at the outcomes that they'll have when they walk across the stage with any type of degree or certificate, when they leave our school.
Anybody else? Assessing the general education outcomes?
Well, I mean, we at Mount Hood is also kind of, initial stages. I don't think we have a system yet. I mean, we probably have, a couple of potential approaches we can look, and one of them is obviously looking at the course level outcomes and then how they satisfy the general education outcome, and then eventually to aggregate and see how we're doing in those specific programs, certificates. But we hope to accomplish that during this year. So this is just still work in progress. It's not something we have already, and kind of still.
Yeah, I'm probably in the same camp I think Rogue is with many of you. I think I still feel like we have a lot to do to differentiate between an institutional learning outcome and a gen ed outcome, because I think you can define those almost interchangeably if you're not careful. I go back to fundamentals when I start getting confused, and I think of the three reasons we assess. We assess so that students know how they are doing. We assess so that as an instructor, know how my students are doing. But we also assess as either a team or a college to ensure that we're doing what we say we're doing. And I think if we go to that level and how we write those gen ed outcomes helps me think about where that sits. And I think a great deal of my thinking, and some of that's a product of my role. I mean, I am hired and paid to look at the large-scale operation of a division, and sometimes that's hard to do without, you can come to a very different conclusion from the large-scale operation of a division versus the classroom and departmental thing. So that's just a general qualifier. I am intentionally speaking from my current role, which is to look broad, not focused. I think it helps us place gen ed outcomes, though, in that third tier. We need to know that if we say you're coming out with numeracy skills, that you are. So by how we define those, then, back to the mapping idea, lets us see where that happens, lets us identify those key assessment points in a way that we can then map that from a student perspective. Maybe they picked up so much of that in their dental program around algebraic functions or how to analyze and interpret information in a graph, that we are not going to need to punch them into 2 math classes because that outcome has been achieved over here. So I think it helps us from an operations standpoint look at how to structure and measure those outcomes in a more focused way when we remember it's to inform our work at that broader scale. But that's clearly, I feel like I need to have that iTunes agreement after everything I say. Please no, blah, read all this. These are all my qualifiers. So that's just a Kirk opinion right now.
All right, so let's just switch gears a little bit and talk about what are some of the challenges and approaches. So I'm making up words too. Some of the challenges and approaches to identifying course gaps and redundancies in our programs. So that's a really easy one, so just jump right in. I'm just looking down. No problem.
Actually, C4. Lori talked a lot about in our mapping exercises that visual exercise actually helps that happen without having us to force it. And I'm all right having to force some things. I mean, that's part of my job, being a large executive officer, manager of a big division. But I much prefer it when people see that as a product of work. And when you look at a map, you're able to see, I just looped them back through Chicago 3 times. I actually don't need to go through Chicago 3 times. I can keep moving. And that's a very different feeling than you need to cut back on the number of sections you're offering. So I think, not to beat a horse, but we really rely on that mapping activity. That is a faculty-driven process, led by faculty, with faculty, because that's where it makes sense. You are the content and progression experts. That's the keeper of the flame role for you. And as faculty then, to be able to sit back and look from I really love my butterfly unit place is hard. When you look at it from a student journey perspective, in an odd sort of way, it depersonalizes that work and lets you look more objectively, or us or a department look more objectively from the travel angle, not from the value of each thing you're seeing on your trip. Because all of us have things we want to see. You know, in Southern Oregon, we want you to see Crater Lake. We want you to see the redwoods. Those are important, cool, wonderful parts of our trip. But if I need to get to Portland, Crater Lake is a side trip. And I can see that when I line out the trip to Portland. If I'm just looking at Southern Oregon, I don't necessarily make that connection, and my heart still sits in getting you to Crater Lake, if that makes any sense.
Well, I definitely want to go on a trip now. And I can also understand why you do get fined, although I enjoy them. So I think seeing Lori's presentation today was wonderful to see how you can, just with a big circle, help start identifying where those gaps are, and redundancies too. Are we teaching the same thing in multiple classes to help streamline? And I'm also faculty, so I agree that it's hard to let go of something that you love, but when you're able to look at it like that and see that it's about the student, it's about what is best for them and getting them through the process successfully, it does make it easier to accept.
Well,
Yep.
and it's like Kirk said, though, it's not as if we're blowing up Crater Lake and you can't ever go there, or it's getting, somehow quadrant off. You can still go there, it's just not the most direct route. So that's the whole idea behind the guided pathways, is we're showing you the most direct route. It's a map. Like any other map, you can choose to use it or you can choose not to. Absolutely. And you can go off on your side trips, and you can even run over and see the coast if you wanted to. But if you want to get to Portland in the most direct route, here's the way to go. So going to use that.
Right.
Is it trademarked?
No, it's not trademarked, because look at how Google Maps works.
Yeah. You want to go the fastest?
You go fast, you go
Direct.
most direct. You can now plug in if you're walking or taking transit or going in your car. It's not us that needs to create how to map. We get how to map. And there's some functionality there that I think it's like now, if someone takes more than 3 days to get something to my house, I'm mad because Amazon has set a standard. Well, folks, I think it's time to realize we don't need to set the standard for mapping. Google already did. They already have established a practice on how we think about a map. We want clear choice. I want to be able to decide how I'm going to get there. I want to plug that in, and I want you to tell me the way to go.
And if I hit a detour?
Reschedule me. I don't think that way on my own anymore. I try to devolve and there are 100 million man jokes about asking directions. I know. I don't need to ask anymore, and I don't need to pretend that I don't need to ask anymore, because I can plug it in how I want. And I think that that's a very simple way to think about what we're trying to provide to our students. We're not saying, I really do believe, we're not saying it is the guided pathway. We are saying it is a guided system of pathways. Ways. And I think that's an important differentiation. And mapping allows you to make choice that's informed. I know now it's the fast way. I know now it's the slow way. I know now it's the expensive way. And I can still make that choice from an informed place.
Very good. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's obviously, I mean, for students, it's important that they make decisions, that they understand the consequences, because, it's okay to take a detour, but they realize that financial aid may not cover that. So that's, and we facing the situation when students more often than not making decisions without realizing what the challenges are and what the consequences would be.
So that actually brings us to the end of the list that we have prepared. So then it's time for everyone else to ask questions, and more importantly, to share what's happening in your areas. So to start that, I would actually like to ask a question of the panel, because especially since there's an IR person here, and that's an area that I'm learning about. What I would like to ask is what role does institutional research, and I don't mean what role, I know that they do, but how are you involved in the assessment process? At what level do you get involved? And what types of things do you do with that?
Well, I think nowadays, actually, the role of institutional research has been evolving a lot during recent years. I think it's no longer the same as it was, even 5 years ago. People probably used to be more like data providers. We need this number, or we need this, research done, or something like that. And that's all that institutional research, I mean, of course, there always potentially were exceptions, but that's kind of the primarily the role that was. Right now it's evolving, and I don't think there is one understanding overall what it is or what it should be. Each school defines it differently, and even within the schools, I don't think right now there is a good, understanding or acceptance that it should be this or it should be that. My personal view that, institutional research should be acting more like a center of excellence that will try to guide, all those areas and support that with the data, because that, good decisions should be based on data. So that's why they should have that role of the center of excellence. And obviously they can't be expert everywhere, and they need to be able to bring, faculty for, when they need their assistance, their knowledge, their expertise, or different areas. So that's kind of the role. So specifically with our college, again, it's also been changing, and right now we got the role that we're in charge of planning, we're in charge of accreditation, we're in charge of institutional research, we're in charge of providing data, dashboards, reports, state and federal reporting, and go on and go on. And I mean, of course, that's puts a little limitation on what you can do. Our resources are pretty limited at what we could have done. So, however, right now, I think that the change we've seen recently, that it's actually being put on us as well, but not in a way to necessarily invent this assessment system, but to be, a body that, is in charge of leading this process. And I think that's been the challenge in the past, that we've been talking about assessment, but there was no really central place who would, it was everybody's task, but it was not one specific area, specific person was in charge to make sure it's happening, it's moving forward, that there is a progress. And I think that's a positive change, and that's for us has changed just last March. I think that was another reorganization, and now that's part of our responsibility. So that's what we're trying to do. We're not necessarily creating this assessment system, but we're creating, the groups, we bring in the faculty who can, who are experts in this and who can create the system. Our role is just, to guide them, to tell them what accreditation requirements are, to tell what expectations are, to see that we're on track, we're staying on track. But that's, I think that's the role we have, and I hope that that's something that would actually work well in the future for us.
We just hired an IR director because, for any number of reasons, but it's been a really nice change, because one of the challenges we've had is probably the same that any number of you do. There's a big difference between interesting data and useful data. And we're really good at sitting down in a meeting and coming up with a list of 58 really interesting things I'd like to know. I'd like to know the average age of the person that reads our catalog. And then maybe we could look at Josephine County and see if it's different than Jackson County, because we can change our marketing strategy. And we spend a lot of time going around the interesting. I really have appreciated the change of focus that's brought by IR to be useful. It needs to be useful. It's the lever, right? You need data to move things with. You don't need data as entertainment. And I think having a department or division or a mind, in our case, a mind, that works that way and has that knowledge base is super helpful to those of us that want to be generalists and have a little bit of information about everything, because that's what we find cool. So I think that focus on useful is a really nice piece that comes out of having an actively engaged IR department.
All right, well then I think we're ready to hear from you guys. So does anyone want to be the first one to share some things or ask a question?
Feel a little wary right now. Sociologist, data-driven, social scientist. I'm a union person, so labor. So just want to be transparent with these questions. I am on board completely with the overall idea of setting up transits, things like that, but I do have some questions based on the track that we went down. What methodologies are each school doing for assessment of guided pathways? Kind of not how did you go about doing it in terms of some of the specifics, kind of like what we have, but more along the lines of what did you do to get started with figuring out how is your guided pathways going to even exist, and what are you going to do? The other question are the House bill going to impact individual class outcomes. Your opinions on that? Will the larger macro scale outcomes eventually ever come down to class outcomes, where for CGCC, for example, faculty have a lot of autonomy in working with these class outcomes. So will eventually you ever see that coming down, where faculty's autonomy of helping with course outcomes go away? And also, I love the metaphor of being on a plane and so forth and so on. Kind of like a destination to go to New York. Has there been any talk about institutional on a community college level majors? So a student comes in and says, I want to be a sociologist. So now we have a guided pathway general education to help the student get to go on to a 4-year degree to be a sociologist, still getting the requirements for general education, but not taking classes that when they go to their 4-year university, they're going to have to be put more in debt and so forth and so on to get through to that. And I know there's 4 questions, sorry. And then what do we see, what's your opinions on guided pathways in response to labor? So are we going to, with 70% or so, 50 to 70% average of faculty members or more in some cases being adjuncts, how do you think that this guided pathway will take courses away? So now people that are every term used to making 1, 2, 3 classes now going down to 2, 1 or no classes, and what do you think that will do?
All right, who wants to jump in first?
We haven't decided what we're doing with guided pathways. In fact, the president was at the table and I said, so what are we going to do? And she looked at me and she says, I'm not going to make that decision alone. That's a collaborative decision that we'll have to make as a team. So all those questions are kind of moot for us because we haven't made that decision. And I think those are great things to consider. And I will definitely bring those to the table, as we all will from our school, but we don't have that decision yet at all.
And I would say to the part about the outcomes, I think from what I understand or from what we heard, so there will be some ideas about these core outcomes that go for the courses, but I would still expect that the individual faculty would be able to choose their outcomes as they align to that. So it's not about matching those outcomes identically. It's about saying, this is my class, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to align to this one to prove that we're covering the same content and this meets that criteria. That's what I would think, and we'll see how that turns out.
Yeah, to add to that same point, yeah, it's not really about setting, the outcomes for the courses, but it's providing the guidelines. And I can give you an example. Like, when we started trying to do that, we realized that some of our classes had literally over 100 course outcomes. So how can you and I'm not joking, it's really true. So how can you possibly assess over 100 outcomes? Or, and then, when we started approaching and those faculty started saying to us, well, let's break it down so we don't assess all outcomes at once, and then it will take like maybe 10 years for us to finally assess a class. So obviously, it's not like, I don't think there would be the direct, like this is the outcomes that you have to have for the class, but there has to be general guidelines in terms of that they are measurable and accessible, in terms of how many of them, etc. So that's it. And I think one other questions I wanted to address, you talk how it's going to affect on part-time faculty. So overall, I think the load would stay there. It's potentially just, before students were taking, potentially maybe classes that were irrelevant. So now they will be taking different classes that actually fit their schedule. So instead of having this 5 sections of 5 different classes, maybe we will have 5 sections of the same class that actually meets their outcomes. So overall, of course, there could be some decline if we become more efficient, but that's something, we can say that we're going to keep more classes so we could keep more jobs at the expense of students taking the classes that they don't need to take. So it's obviously, we have to make some sacrifice and agree what's more important to us. But otherwise, I don't think necessarily, overall that the load would disappear. It just would be redirected so students would be taking the classes they need rather than just anything they wanted.
I'm going to say one more thing on the outcomes. To me, if you're going to use your New York analogy, the outcomes for the course, even if they are all the same, however you get there, as an instructor is always going to be your academic freedom. And hopefully it won't come down to all the college courses across Oregon have to use the same book. You know, that's where we all kind of go, whoa, academic freedom. But if the outcomes are all the same, I have no problem matching my outcomes. I'll match my teaching up to anybody else's outcomes, and we'll get there. But it's going to be using my academic freedom and my autonomous teaching style to get there. That's what makes me a teacher. At least that's how I see it.
And I would, just to follow along with that, and I won't say New York again, I promise. I do think that with very few exceptions, it is reasonable to expect that courses need to connect to other courses. They are rarely, in my experience, a complete and unique standalone project. And I think within departments or programs, there is then an expectation that those outcomes are either reinforcing or mutually supporting of the other courses that they either feed into or the degree that they are part of. And so I think while there is definitely a recognition and respect of the autonomy within a classroom, I think there is a reality that those are connected. They are not independent. So the freedom is already not there, to phrase that weird. It's already not there. There's already an expectation that the connectiveness, I made up a word there too, connectivity is there. So I don't see that it will reduce or hamper that. If anything, I think it will make it more clear that the end result is important in terms of kind of having that commonality or that uniform feel or that lack of freedom that can feel like. But how you get there, in my mind when I taught, that was the joy of it to me, is in figuring out, I know I need to get a persuasive speech in. That's just a given. How I get them there and how I structure the work to get there and link to my students that are in front of me in that class at that time, that's the joy of the teaching part to me. I don't think that will go away or be hampered. I mean, why would we want that joy to go away? An electric teacher is the most exciting thing that we can put in front of a student. In terms of labor, that is a role I wear in my hat. I am the lead negotiator for the management side. I think they said it really quite brilliantly. I think the other factor to consider is we actually may be in a position of adding classes. We have known choke points. And if you pathway that up and really look at your map, there's a very likely outcome from an institutional side that we'll have choke points where we actually need to expand our number of courses. And sadly, some of those are the courses, I don't want to teach CS 120 or I don't want to teach Writing 115. That may be the labor decision point that becomes challenging then, is when you have a mix of experienced full-timers and new part-timers, how do you use assignment in a way that's equitable and recognizes experience and authenticity and ability, and yet still spreads out that load of that class that no one wants, right? I think that'll be a place that will not necessarily be contract, but in practice, it will be a difficult conversation to have. You know, I know there are a lot of departments that assign based on seniority and interest. And Pathways is going to be a challenge to that style of assignment because it becomes student pathway driven and highway traffic driven. If I need 120 butt seats in CS 120, I got to have 120 butt seats or I choke my pathway down so far, students get bounced right out of it. That's where I think the labor conversations are likely to hit difficult times, if that makes more sense. Did you get all four of yours answered by the panel? Cool.
So I'm not sure if this is a question or more of a comment, but again, I'm the humanities guy, and thinking about we often talk about measuring what these student outcomes as if students learn these things, prove that they can do them, and then keep that skill forever. We don't do that as faculty. And I think sometimes our students don't do that, but we all of the language around this assumes that, okay, my student could write a thesis sentence when she passed Writing 115, and now it's 4 years later, and they're in my history class, why can't she write a sentence. Or when we get even more abstract, we go, well, you can think critically about this issue, but when we transfer that skill into another class, we suddenly seem to lose all ability to think critically or consider cultural literacy. So, this is particularly clear when we think about a student who could do certain math tasks when they graduated from high school, but now that's 6 years later, or maybe 6 months later, and now we think, well, we checked that box, we said, okay, they can do that, but they can't. And how does our assessment process acknowledge that people don't learn skills and then keep them forever? Or they can't transfer from one area to another. I'll stop and see if you have any wisdom to share.
I may not have any wisdom, but I think that's the whole effort behind assessment, is to make sure that we can find out where this lag time, where these gaps are happening. And if we use our assessment tool wisely, then we'll be able to see, gee, Johnny could do this first year, and when he leaves here, he can't do it. Where did we drop the ball? And our assessment tools should be able to affect that improvement. That's why we do it. So I think that's the great opportunity of assessment and why it's important to us beyond accreditation, but to help those students to keep those skills and to keep reinforcing those skills so those skills become masterful. And I think that's the proper way to use our assessment beyond everything else.
And I also would think, overall, obviously, skills have different value and over time. Like, I used to teach some computer science courses, and I know sometimes you can acquire some skills that 5-7 years later are completely useless. So the point The point of education, as I see that, it's not necessarily that all skills that you learn that you will need to apply, or you will be applying, or you will even remember, but to prove the ability that you are able to acquire those skills. You know how to do that. You know how to acquire that knowledge that could be useful. And when we do assessment, again, it's not, we may assess a skill that may not be very valuable later. However, by assessing that and confirming that the student has actually acquired that skill, will prove that the student is able to learn. And quite often, I think that's how we see the value, like, of associate degree, of bachelor degree. You know, when we look at that, I mean, it's more like a proof that students are able to master, you know, to master some content at certain level, that they prove that ability. Because, you know, there are definitely some skills that stay throughout the life, but there are some that has like expiration date. And to me, the assessment is really showing that the students are able to do it.
And I think as a humanities guy myself, I have had a very interesting career. I've been lucky. I've been able to work in elementary, middle school, high school, and college. So this is a question that comes up frequently. And it sounds like heresy, but if you think about the process of writing, and I'm just going to pick that one because I know it well, that's been taught since 3rd grade. We start at that game of a clear thesis, supporting points, and analysis very early. This is a model that is like this always. It's a cyclical model. Our assessment, I believe, should equally be cyclical. Not only should our assessment be, because we grow in sophistication and rigor. We don't necessarily grow into, we're going to move you from basic calculation to theoretical calculus, and I'd love to be able to give an example of that, but everyone in the room that knows what it is would know I was lying. You know, it is a cyclical nature in some degree in the humanities. If our assessment points are identifying that there are critical outcomes that are not mastered at a level that allows student success, then we have 2 choices. And I'm not trying to oversimplify, but we really do only have 2 choices. We decide that maybe that outcome is not as critical as we think. It's clearly not being deployed very far outside of my classroom. It's clearly not being embedded into a student's way of life or critical or ongoing structures where they need to deploy that skill. And I would argue that's a legitimate question to ask of ourselves. Not about a thesis sentence, but I'm just using an example. I think the second thing that it forces us to do is examine our instructional practices. If we've identified and determined that it's critical to our course, it's a critical outcome, and students are still failing it, then we need to teach it again. I don't want to sound like I'm oversimplifying by any stretch, but in some degree it is that straightforward. An effective assessment tool shows you what you need to do differently as an instructor, department, or division, and it shows the student where there is a gap in what they should know and what they can do. So we either assess by adding instructional strategies, supports, or different approaches, or we evaluate whether that outcome is critical enough that we're going to dump that level of resource into it. And I think an effective outcome model helps us with that very problem, because the expectation is that we continue to accelerate the sophistication and rigor behind that effort. So if we have to go back to where we can make sure we have a foundational understanding of that effort to again raise the critical thinking or the rigor or the sophistication, then that is our role. That is how we know we are an effective instructional division.
Hi. So I wanted to make a comment on that question as well, and then I have my own question, so don't let me forget my question. I agree with what was just said up there, that I think there are different values or different levels of outcomes, and ones that will be, that we hope that are carried forth throughout a lifetime of work and university transfer, et cetera, and then that there are outcomes in probably more at the course level that we know can easily be forgotten from one moment to the next, or from one course to the next and to the next thing. But those feed up into those more global outcomes that we want them to take with them at a larger scale. And then I also think at our institution, at CGCC, one of the things that we're thinking about a lot this year is a campus-wide campaign for outcomes. And each one, we work on assessing one global outcome each year. And we're going to move up to 2 outcomes at sometimes. But I lost my train of thought, that it's everybody's effort in teaching that outcome and helping students achieve that outcome. So it's not just the writing department that's responsible for communication. It's everybody who's responsible for communication, and we have everybody who has mapped their role in teaching that global outcome, and now we're assessing how did we do in that global outcome this year, and then we bring that information back to them and said, this is what our assessment showed in our student learning overall in this global outcome. What can we do as a group, as a college, to reinforce that? Because those are the 5 outcomes that we promise students are supposed to leave with when they have a degree. I can't promise that you're going to remember every one of the IT outcomes and every one of this outcome and that outcome when you leave, but we're saying you're going to have some level of understanding of those 5 outcomes when you leave, and we want you to carry that with you, and hopefully they will. Okay. So my question was something that Kirk said that perked my ears and made me nervous, and then I went, no, I'm not going to be nervous, was, and maybe I'm misquoting you or misunderstood it, but I believe you said something along the lines that the danger of like conflating gen ed outcomes with institutional outcomes. And there seemed to be sort of a consensus nodding up there for that statement. We at Columbia Gorge unashamedly use our institutional outcomes as our gen ed outcomes. And we believe that is appropriate, and we say that that's the gen ed responsibility to do those, and so they're the gen ed outcomes. So I was just wondering if I misheard you, or if you could speak to that danger of what you think exists.
No, I don't think you misheard me. I think you've made a decision that clarified the answer to that internally. And I think back to the context where I said that was we were talking about how to use pathway structures with that kind of gen ed work and how do they work with one another. So my context was really around the idea if you treat your gen ed coursework like a program, you're going to run into trouble because they don't line out like a program. So I'm trying to just think back to when I said that, because now I'm nervous too. But no, I think in general my concern is that numeracy or literacy or the ability to write a coherent and effective persuasive paragraph can be defined as institutional learning outcomes or gen ed outcomes depending on how you do that. And I guess the danger to me is in how you define it determines where you look to assess and measure. So if I have a gen ed outcome and I'm driving a gen ed report in my accreditation thing and I'm speaking to gen ed outcomes and assessments, and yet I'm not assessing or evaluating those in what are perceived by most to be your gen ed courses, then are you doing institutional learning outcomes or gen ed outcomes? And I think there's a challenge in the language. Does that make more sense? No, not much. Let me try another example. I think critical thinking is one that always likes to pop onto anything, right? We want our students to think critically. Is that an institutional outcome that every course should support, or is that a gen ed outcome that lives in a place? And I think that is where you can get challenged if you try to mix and match or do both. So it's not, I don't have a sense of direction on which one is right, because I think at Rogue, and I'm going to look at my team, I don't think we're solid on how we use those yet. I think we bounce back and forth between those two. And until we land on when we say gen ed, we mean internally this, and when we say institutional level outcomes, we mean this. So in our thinking, institutional level outcome, any student that hits RCC will leave with some basic structural tenets based on their education. I think that's an institutional level outcome, regardless of program. They could be in continuing ed, and I want them tackling some of those institutional outcomes. Able to understand and operate within complex systems. Every one of our programs ought to help a student there. I think differently when I go to a more skill-based piece, like explain or articulate a position and support it with evidence. That feels more like a gen ed outcome to me, and I'll build it that way. But I don't want to try to build it for both, if that makes more sense. And you can see, I guess you can see, this is still the debate we're in at the college. I don't have a foot on either. I'm still straddling that fence right now. So that's why I think my answer is still confusing, because frankly, I'm still confused.
So at my school, and I'm from Umpqua, so we have institutional outcomes that are like what you're speaking to as general education. And those outcomes are like preparing people to be out into the world. So they're like they have the skills ready to be successful in a job, that they have, that they're a productive member of society, and it's worded in a certain way about respecting cultural and diversity, and that they're able to communicate and to do these kind of global, again, like Kirk was just saying, that regardless of what they're in, whether they're in community ed or our credit classes, these are just the ways that we want them to go out and function in the world after they leave us. And then with the general ed, which we're right now using the AOT, that's, when I think about it, that's like those foundational, again, that you get in those transfer classes, and you get them across all, but you specifically in the transfer classes to go on to that next level. And so we've been looking at them separately. So again, and that's why whenever Amber had mentioned earlier, it's like, that's a case where we're not using a shared language, and we do need to, for I guess at this point, each school has to identify how they're thinking of it and what it means to them, because it's a little bit just different perspective on it determines how you move forward with it.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm going back to your New York trip there for just a second because I have a follow-up question on it. I'm sorry. I think it's more of a challenge that I see. I don't know that you all have an answer for, but if you're thinking of giving students a specific path to get to New York, and your most cost-effective or most direct way is the airplane, and you have 5 students on that train, is that train actually going to go there? Or is it going to say, that's not cost effective, I'm going to send them all going on that airplane? I mean, I guess with limited funding, where do you see the Amish cart and the train still being able to run?
I'll take a stab at it first, Kirk. I don't think we have anybody here from Tillamook Bay. Am I right?
From where?
Tillamook Bay, who's our tiniest college. And so part of what I want to offer is that they've made an institutional decision that they're going to have the ox cart and the plane, because they're small enough that if they don't have that many students, and they may only have 2 who will be in a course, and they've made the decision institutionally, again, this is an institution by institution decision, but they've made the decision institutionally that that's going to go, because we've made a map for our students saying this course will be in this term, this course will be in this term, this course will be in this term. We're going to run it even if it only has 2. So they still are, they're able to do that. Now, how they're funding that, I have no idea. But what I'm saying is that it's an institutional choice that they made in order to make that work for their students. Now, you're all in different contexts. Obviously, Portland couldn't do something like that. But when you look at the institutional context and what you need to do in order to serve the students that you have, that's the choice that they made. Does that help? Kind of?
I guess part of my question is for those that may not end up in a path, you know, I mean, because is every course going to be a pathway, right? There's going to be those courses that just fall under interest, I want to go on a train ride, right?
Those will still be there. Those will still be there. The running course in the President's Council is vampire literature, is the one. But what about vampire literature? What will we do with vampire literature? The thing that we're talking about is when we look at having 500 courses that students can choose from, that we're saying these are general education requirements. Really? I mean, if we're looking at the paths, right? If we're looking at the paths, and again, this is a guide. We're saying to the student, if you want to get to New York, we're going to keep using that. If you want to get to New York as fast as possible, here's the way to go. However, if you want to take a side trip and take vampire literature over here, you can. It's not on your direct path, but that's your choice. So those courses are still there. They may not be offered every term. They may not be part of the requirements that we're saying students need for their degrees, but they would still exist. That's another institutional conversation too, obviously, but this isn't a way to weed out all of the special interest type courses. But we are looking at how do these courses help a student on his or her trajectory? Does that course transfer anywhere? And if it doesn't, let's think about why we're teaching it. Let's think about what that does for our students and think about why it is that we're actually saying you should. So it opens up another conversation, I think. Kirk, did you want to say anything?
I would just add that I think we need to be realistic with ourselves about why our students are there. Because I think it's very easy to take our frame of reference, and for the most part, we're all products of liking and loving and enjoying education and liking and loving a subject area. And I think it's easy to lay that over the top. And I would encourage us, or at least ask, and this is just as a panel member, Rogue, this is not a VP comment. I think we need to recognize that I would be willing to bet a large number of our students, this is not a question of access or completion. They're there to change their situation. They are not there to explore. They are there for a very specific purpose that's more than likely advancement or change in employment. Somehow they're there to change their trajectory. I would argue that we have far more students in community college that are there for a clear and direct purpose, and to beat the metaphor to death, they are simply not interested in winding their way there. They want to get there and be done with it. I think we do a disservice to not recognize that. We spend a lot of time wondering about how we're harming those who, not all who wonder, are lost students. I would argue that, sadly to me, because I was one of those, I started with psych major, then it was a theater major, then it was an education major, then it was a policy and management major, and I still now pick up an EMS class because I want to save people, and you know what I mean? I mean, I'm a wonder and not lost guy. I don't think many of our students are that way anymore. I think a lot of them are there with a very specific focus, and if you ask them what they hope they can get in and get out as fast as possible and get on to the next. So if they're really aiming at the next, we need to honor that. And I think Pathways is a way to honor that. I do think there will still be choices to be made, but folks, we already do that now. We cut classes on a single point equation. We cut them on the number of students that are in that class. I think it'll be refreshing to be able to say, no, we got to have 5 sections because I'm not going to build a choke point. I'm going to run it because I got to get that pipeline fat and wide. And if I have a chance to build that in because now I've got an instructor that I've got a gap that I need to fill because I have an 80% load instead of a 100% load, how about vampire literature? I heard that class sucks, but you can get it in there. Right? Sorry, it's after lunch. We got to do something to keep you alert. I think we can do both because I think we already do both. I don't think we do both well. I would like us to use pathways to do well for those students who feel that last vestige of education is my hope for change. That's where I'm a crusader, if you can't tell. They need to be able to make a change, and the way we can help them make a change is to be as efficient and clear and effective as we can be in helping them do that, and I think pathways resonates with me in a way to do that work.
And if anybody's been part of Achieving the Dream or had the community college survey of student engagement or heard Kay McClenny, time and again, the research shows that students are telling us, if you know what works for me, tell me. Don't make me wander and figure it out for myself. Just tell me.
I want to come back to the gen ed discussion that we were having a minute ago. So I'm a little worried with the House bill ignoring what they're asking us to do as far as pathways to the 4 years. And I'm worried about us talking about gen ed outcomes differently at different institutions. So if some of us are thinking about the gen ed outcomes as institutional and foundational, and some of us are talking about it in terms of program, are we not just digging a hole for ourselves that we'll have to come back and fix later? You all are looking at me like that didn't make sense.
No, I think you made sense. I think you probably articulated my statement better than I did in your question. That's the worry I've got. I really appreciated your comment. I didn't put the words together in my head until she said it out loud, but I do think gen ed and transfer outcomes, that's the synonymous piece I use. I'm not sure that's right, because I do think there are other people who include those larger aspirational, when my students leave Rogue, I want them to all be able to do this stuff, be a good citizen. I don't think of that as a gen ed outcome, okay? So that's my own blind spot. If I may be bold, and where's Elizabeth? Plug your ears. The elephant in the room on the transfer bill is it's not on us. We could build a lot of pathways, and if the terminal station changes every time we get a track laid down, it's not going to matter. That's the problem we face now. We build a pathway to connect at Chicago to get to New York, and then we turn around and they actually wanted it over at Toledo, and we missed. Right? You know, we had an experience with that around the AOT. One of the universities changed their mind about a math class. And depending on how attached to that math class you were, we left a bunch of people hanging. I am worried that we almost need it to be built the other way, which, don't get me wrong, that's a super scary proposition to me. But it's got to be like the golden spike. You know, you don't want to build together and end up with your train tracks 1.5 miles apart. So I think being clear on what we mean by those outcomes is important. The good news to me, transfer is not a pathways movement. That's a degree movement. So we're going to sit down around business and line that out with business, or we're going to sit down and line that out with psych and line it out. I think we still have that same discussion. And I know I'm not answering your question. I've got the exact same one.
So while I have people in the room that are actually part of this House Bill 2998, or what, is that the right number? Okay. I'm a science instructor. I'm a biology instructor. And one of the things, I don't know if this is a problem for all disciplines, but in science, the big problem with transfer is that community colleges are seen as gen ed places. And having our science students take all of their gen ed at a community college in 2 or even 3 years, along with their first 2 years of math and science, isn't going to work. A, they can't do it in 3 years, so then we're going to get dinged for them not completing their program in 3 years. And B, it's going to leave them with no gen ed requirements for their junior and senior year. They're not going to take all advanced math, science classes, or their head will explode. And so they're not going to get full financial aid. And so I just keep preaching this every time I see anybody that's on this committee. So I don't know that I have a question. Maybe my question is this bill going to deal with that aspect of the AAOT that has always been a problem, and one of the reasons why very few math and science students actually get an AAOT. I know very few students, period, get an AAOT, but math and science is even smaller.
So I'll take that. I'll take that arrow. So part of the bill, the requirements are that a student would be a junior in the major when they transfer. And so that's a huge part of the conversation because, okay, what does that mean? And what does that look like? And that kind of thing. Because I think we all recognize getting all of your gen ed done in the front end is ridiculous. I mean, I don't know did anybody in here do that? I didn't do that. I was still taking gen ed when I was a senior in my undergrad. And that's, well, and it's right. You don't want to take all of your major courses at the same time. Your head would explode, no matter, whichever discipline you might be in. I can't even imagine in hard sciences. That would be crazy. So that is one of the huge conversations in this work group. One of the examples that I'll use, there's a community college, the education departments, a lot of the education folks got together, and they were having this conversation because they said, it's ridiculous that a student would try to take all of their gen ed in the first 2 years, and then no courses in education, and then you transfer, and then you're taking courses with freshmen that are these introductory type courses that we could teach at the community college. That's silly. So they were putting together a map showing where the community colleges could teach these certain introductory level courses along with general education, such that when a student did transfer to Western Oregon University, as an example, he or she would be a junior in the major, would already have those requirements taken, so that they could truly be in the place where they would have been had they started at the university as a native. So that's going to be a huge lift out of all of this work, but it's absolutely part of it. And prayers are welcome. Any other questions? Well, help me thank the panel.